I always thought vampires were just stories mothers told to keep their daughters obedient. Dark fairy tales whispered at bedtime about creatures carved from moonlight and hunger, beings who saw humans as nothing more than beating hearts wrapped in fragile skin, vessels to be emptied and discarded like yesterday's wine. My grandmother used to say that vampires could smell fear the way wolves smell blood on the wind, that they move through shadows the way fish glide through water, and that if one ever looked you directly in the eyes, you would forget your own name, your own past, everything that made you human before you could even remember theirs. I grew up believing these stories were exaggerations, the kind of myths that get inflated over generations until truth becomes so entangled with fantasy that no one can separate them anymore. Our village lay far enough from the vampire territories that we rarely saw them in person, and when we did catch glimpses of them passing through on whatever mysterious business occupied immortals, they moved quickly, efficiently, like storms that had somewhere infinitely more important to be. They existed in the periphery of our lives, powerful and distant and utterly indifferent, like gods who had better things to do than concern themselves with mortals scraping by in forgotten corners of a realm they had ruled for longer than anyone could remember. The vampires had their world, vast and ancient and incomprehensible. We had ours, small and fragile and desperately mortal, and there was an understanding, unspoken but absolute, that those two worlds should never, ever touch. That crossing that boundary, in either direction, led only to tragedy and transformation, and most people could not tell the difference between the two until it was far too late to matter. I never imagined I would stand before a vampire prince and feel my own traitorous heart betray me with something far more dangerous than fear. Something that felt like recognition, like déjà vu, like coming home to a place I had never been, but had somehow been dreaming about my entire life without realizing it. Something that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, about destiny, about the careful distance we all maintained between their shadowed world and our sunlit one. They called it the selection. 30 mortal girls pulled from ordinary lives and thrust into something extraordinary, something that felt more like a waking dream than any kind of reality I understood. Chosen through methods no one would explain, by criteria no one understood, for purposes that went far beyond simple romance or political alliance. One vampire prince who needed to choose not just a bride, but a bridge between two species that had spent centuries perfecting the delicate art of mutual mistrust, and a crown that promised to either bind our two worlds together forever in something resembling peace, or shatter them both into fragments too small to recognize in the apocalyptic attempt. This is the story of how I became one of those 30 girls, how I fell in love with a prince who could kill me with nothing more than a thought, a gesture, a moment of lost control. How I learned that some choices are not really choices at all, but destiny masquerading as free will, carved into the fabric of your life long before you ever suspected you had a destiny worth carving. And how I discovered that surviving is sometimes harder, infinitely more complicated, and strangely more beautiful than any fairy tale ending could ever hope to be. But I am getting ahead of myself. Every story has a beginning, even the ones that feel like they have always been happening, waiting in the shadows of the future for us to catch up to them. Mine started on a night when the air tasted wrong, and my mother's hands shook as she braided my hair before bed, her fingers clumsy with a fear she refused to name out loud, as if speaking it would make it more real than it already was. Chapter 1. The announcement. The night the royal envoys came to our district, the air tasted different. Sharper, heavier, charged with something electric and ominous that made the hair on my arms stand up, even though the evening was unusually warm for autumn, unseasonably hot in a way that felt deliberate, orchestrated. It was that peculiar feeling you get right before lightning strikes during a summer storm, when your skin prickles with mingled anticipation and dread woven together so tightly you cannot possibly separate them. When every instinct you possess screams that something fundamental is about to change, but you have absolutely no idea whether that change will break you or remake you into something stronger, stranger, unrecognizable to the person you were just moments before. The kind of moment that divides your life into before and after with surgical precision, though you rarely recognize it until you are standing firmly in the after, looking back at the person you used to be with a mixture of nostalgia and pity and something that might be envy for their innocence, their ignorance, their ability to sleep through the night without nightmares. I stood in the town square with my mother gripping my hand so hard I could feel each individual finger digging into my skin like brands, leaving marks that would fade by morning, but that I could still feel days later, phantom impressions of her desperate attempt to hold on to me, to anchor me to this world through sheer force of will. Her palm was cold despite the lingering summer heat that still clung to the cobblestones from the day, despite the press of bodies around us as what seemed like the entire village crowded into the square, drawn by rumors and whispers, and that peculiar human instinct that makes us gather together when we sense danger approaching, as if there is safety in numbers against threats that can move faster than thought and kill with less effort than breathing. My younger brother Thomas stood on my other side, his small hand clutching my skirt with that particular white-knuckled intensity children develop when they sense adults are lying to them about something important, when they can feel the fear radiating off their parents like heat from a fire, but no one will admit there is anything to be afraid of. At 10 years old, he was already developing the skepticism and sharp-eyed wariness that came from growing up in a world that promised very little and usually delivered even less than that. He had learned young that life was not fair, that bad things happened to good people, that the universe did not care about your plans or dreams or desperate hopes. The royal envoys arrived precisely at midnight, because vampires loved their theatrics almost as much as they loved their blood, and they had centuries upon centuries to perfect both. We heard them before we saw them, the sound of hooves on stone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the buildings and the mountains beyond in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint their exact direction or even how many riders there actually were. The sound built and built until it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull, a rhythmic pounding that matched my accelerating heartbeat that made my teeth ache and my bones vibrate in sympathy. Then the fog rolled in, thick and unnatural, carrying that distinctive sweet sick smell of magic being worked by hands that had perfected the craft over centuries of relentless practice. It was not the soft morning mist that sometimes rose from the river on cool autumn mornings, gentle and natural and reassuring in its predictability. This was something else entirely, something deliberate and controlled, summoned for effect as much as function, designed to unsettle and intimidate and remind us exactly what we were dealing with. The fog moved with purpose, curling around ankles like living things and reaching up walls with fingers of vapor, and where it touched, the air grew cold enough to make people shiver and pull their cloaks tighter despite the warm night. The carriages emerged from that supernatural fog like ships breaching through storm clouds, materialized out of nothingness with the abruptness of a nightmare beginning, the moment when you realize you have crossed from waking into sleep and there is no going back until the dream releases you. They looked carved from obsidian and shadow and midnight itself, all sharp, impossible angles and surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, that drank in the torchlight and gave nothing back. The wheels made absolutely no sound against the cobblestones despite what must have been considerable weight, as if the carriages were not quite touching the ground, hovering a fraction of an inch above reality in the way only things touched by deep magic can. The horses pulling them were massive beasts, each one easily 17 hands high, black as midnight, with not a single white marking to break up that absolute darkness. Their eyes glowed like embers in the torchlight, red and feral and distinctly wrong in ways that made my stomach clench with instinctive fear that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with ancient prey instincts recognizing predator. I remember thinking they looked like they had been stolen from nightmares and broken to harness through methods I did not want to imagine, trained to pull the damned to their judgment with the same dispassionate efficiency they might pull any other cargo. Everything about the envoys screamed otherness from the moment they stepped down from those impossible carriages, with movements that were too fluid, too controlled, too perfect to be anything remotely human. The way they moved with that preternatural grace that made every human gesture look clumsy and awkward and painfully slow in comparison, like we were all wading through honey while they danced on air. The way their eyes caught the torchlight and reflected it back in shades of crimson and gold and amber, like they had captured pieces of fire and trapped them inside their skulls, like their eyes were windows into furnaces that burned with a heat that would never consume them because they were already beyond consumption, beyond change, fixed in their perfection like insects preserved in amber. The way they smiled with teeth that were just a fraction too sharp, too white, too perfect to be anything natural, anything human. Teeth that promised pain and pleasure in equal measure, that suggested they knew secrets about mortality that we could never understand, that they had forgotten more about life and death than we would learn in our brief, flickering existences. The way they barely seemed to breathe, their chests rising and falling in rhythms that were almost but not quite right, as if breathing was something they remembered how to do rather than something their bodies required, a habit maintained out of nostalgia for the humanity they had lost centuries ago. The head envoy stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent with a speed that spoke of ancient, instinctive, bone-deep fear that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the genetic memory of being prey, of existing as food for something higher on the chain, of remembering in our cells and our blood what it meant to be hunted by something that could never tire, never stop, never show mercy. She was a woman, or had been once, though how long ago was impossible to say with any certainty. Decades, centuries, millennia. Time worked differently for them, leaving marks that were subtle and strange rather than obvious, aging them in ways that had nothing to do with wrinkles or gray hair or any of the normal human signifiers of years passing. She had hair the color of midnight rivers, black with hints of blue and purple that shifted in the torchlight like oil on water, falling past her waist in a curtain that moved like liquid rather than any normal textile. Her skin was so pale it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, luminous and perfect and completely bloodless, stretched over bones that were just slightly too delicate to be human, too refined, as if someone had taken a normal face and improved it past the point of comfort into something that triggered uncanny valley responses in everyone who looked at her. Her dress looked like it had been woven from spider silk and starlight, and shadows made solid, flowing around her in ways that defied physics and gravity, moving with her body and sometimes independently of it, as if the fabric had its own will and merely chose to follow her movements out of courtesy rather than necessity. When she smiled, it promised secrets you would spend the rest of your abbreviated life regretting learning. Secrets that would poison your dreams and taint your waking hours and make you wish you could scrub your brain clean of the knowledge they contained. Secrets that could never be unlearned, no matter how desperately you might wish otherwise, no matter how many prayers you offered to gods who had stopped listening to human supplications centuries ago when vampires first revealed themselves and shattered our comfortable illusions about our place in the cosmic order. She spoke in a voice that carried across the entire square without her having to raise it even slightly, as if the air itself bent to her will and carried her words directly into our ears, bypassing the normal mechanisms of sound and distance and physics. The voice was beautiful in a terrifying way, like poisoned honey, like music played on instruments made from bones and strung with sinew, like wind chimes made from glass that used to be part of a cathedral window before the building burned. It resonated in my chest and behind my eyes and somewhere deep in my stomach where fear lives, setting up harmonics that made me feel sick and fascinated in equal measure. She told us, in that impossible carrying voice, that Crown Prince Dorian had reached the age where tradition demanded he choose a consort, a partner to stand beside him as he prepared to inherit the throne from his father, the ancient king who had ruled the vampire territories for longer than most human families could trace their lineage, who had been old when my great-great-great-grandparents were young, who remembered empires that had risen and fallen while he remained constant, unchanging, eternal. Her words were formal, rehearsed, delivered with the precision of someone who had given this exact speech dozens of times before in dozens of other villages just like ours, watching the same expressions of fear and hope war across dozens of similar faces, seeing the same desperate calculations happening behind dozens of pairs of human eyes. But then she said something that sent whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat fields, something that made my mother's already crushing grip on my hand tighten even further, until I thought the small bones would crack and splinter under the pressure. The prince would not be choosing from vampire nobility as ancient tradition dictated, as every heir before him had done since the founding of their dynasty over 1,000 years ago, when the world was younger and humans still thought they might win the war for supremacy. No. The king himself had decreed something unprecedented, something revolutionary, something that had not been done in the entire blood-soaked history of their kind. They would choose 30 girls from the mortal population. Common girls. Daughters of blacksmiths and bakers, farmers and merchants, carpenters and healers and tavern keepers. Girls with dirt under their fingernails and calluses on their hands from actual work. Girls like me, whose families scraped by rather than prospered, who understood hunger and cold, and the constant low-level fear that came from existing at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. the envoy explained, her voice never wavering despite the growing noise from the crowd, that we would be brought to the palace in the heart of the vampire-controlled territories and presented before the prince in formal ceremonies that would test our grace, our intelligence, our ability to adapt to a world utterly foreign to everything we had ever known. We would be educated in the intricate ways of the vampire court, taught etiquette and politics and all the subtle languages of power that ruled in that shadowed world, where words meant three things at once and every gesture carried weight. We would be given opportunities to prove ourselves worthy of standing beside a prince, to demonstrate that we possess the strength and intelligence and adaptability that such a position would require, that we were more than simple peasant girls playing dress-up in a world too sophisticated for us to understand. One mortal to bind the vampire court to the human realms, one girl to bridge centuries of mistrust, fear, suspicion, and barely concealed hatred that ran so deep it had become part of the cultural bedrock for both species. One selection to either save both our peoples from sliding back into open warfare, or damn us all to a conflict that would make the previous wars look like children's squabbles, depending entirely on who you asked and what their own fears and prejudices dictated their answer should be. The crowd erupted like a disturbed hive, like a pot that had been simmering for too long finally boiling over. People were shouting questions that overlapped and tangled together into incomprehensible noise, a wall of sound that hurt my ears. Demanding to know why, what this meant, whether this was truly the king's will or some elaborate trap designed to lure mortal girls to their doom under the guise of opportunity. Demanding to know what would happen to the girls who were not chosen, whether they would be returned safely to their families, or whether the selection was just a sophisticated way to stock the palace larders with fresh blood, without having to raid villages directly and risk igniting another war. Others were already backing away from the square, as if distance could protect them from whatever was about to happen, as if they could somehow unlearn what they had just heard and go back to their lives as they had been before, ignorant and safe. And a few, mostly the mothers of daughters of marriageable age, were already calculating with that particular sharp cunning look people get when they see opportunity, where others see only danger, when they glimpse a chance for their daughters to rise above their stations, even if it meant risking everything in the process, even if it meant potentially sacrificing those daughters to something beyond their comprehension. My mother's grip on my hand shifted from painful to crushing to something beyond crushing, something that felt like she was trying to press her very life force into my skin through sheer desperate will, trying to tether me to this world, to this life, to her. I could feel her pulse hammering against my wrist, fast and frantic and terrified in a way that made my own heart start racing in sympathetic panic. Behind us, someone muttered that this was madness, that everyone knew what happened to humans who got too close to vampires, that the stories were consistent across centuries and cultures and continents about what became of mortals who caught the attention of immortals. The stories were endless and varied in their specific details, but they all ended the same way, with the same inevitable conclusion. With the human changed beyond recognition, drained and twisted into something that belonged to neither world, too altered to ever return home, but not changed enough to join the creatures who had transformed them, or dead, consumed in one of 1,000 terrible ways that people whispered about but never discussed openly, or worse, caught somewhere between those two states, belonging to neither world and accepted by none, too changed to return home but not changed enough to survive in the vampire court, condemned to exist in that liminal space forever, slowly going mad from the isolation and the hunger and the knowledge of what they had lost. The envoy waited for the noise to die down with that inhuman patience that reminded us all exactly what she was, what she had been for far longer than any of us had been alive, standing perfectly still while chaos swirled around her like water around stone. She did not fidget, did not shift her weight from foot to foot, did not display any of the small unconscious movements that marked something as alive and human and subject to the normal pressures of existence. She simply existed, immutable and implacable, as fixed as a statue carved from something harder than granite, until the crowd slowly fell silent again, cowed by that very stillness into remembering their fear. When silence finally returned, brittle and fragile and ready to shatter at the slightest provocation, she continued speaking as if there had been no interruption at all, about the selection process, though she refused to elaborate on the actual methodology they would use to choose which girls would be summoned, what criteria would determine who was selected and who was passed over. about how the chosen girls would be given safe passage to the capital, in the vampire-controlled territories, traveling in carriages enchanted against harm by magics older than most human kingdoms. About how they would be housed in the palace itself, in quarters that had once been reserved for visiting nobility from allied vampire clans, rooms that had not been occupied by humans in living memory. About how they would want for nothing during their time there, regardless of whether they were ultimately chosen as the prince's bride, as if material comfort could somehow compensate for the terror and uncertainty they would endure, as if silk sheets and fine food could make up for being trapped in a palace full of creatures who saw them as prey playing at being equals. She made it sound almost appealing, almost like an opportunity rather than a potential death sentence, and I watched several of the younger girls in the crowd start to look excited rather than afraid, their eyes lighting up with dreams of escaping their predetermined futures. I listened to all of this with a growing sense of unreality, as if I had accidentally stumbled into someone else's story by mistake and would wake up any moment in my own bed, in my own life, where vampires were distant legends rather than immediate threats and selections, were things that happened to other people in other places, people who lived in books rather than in the same village where I had spent my entire unremarkable existence. I thought I would be safe. The mathematics seemed irrefutable, the odds overwhelmingly in my favor. There were hundreds of eligible girls in our district alone, young women between 16 and 23 who met whatever mysterious criteria the vampires were using. And if the rumors about how far the selection would reach were accurate, if they were truly drawing from all the mortal territories across the entire kingdom, then there would be thousands of candidates to choose from. Thousands of girls prettier than me, smarter than me, more accomplished, better educated, from better families with better prospects. Girls who had been trained their entire lives for something like this, groomed for advantageous marriages to powerful men, taught how to smile and curtsy and say the right things at the right times. The odds of being chosen felt impossibly, laughably small, like trying to catch starlight in your bare hands or count all the fish in the ocean or hold back the tide with willpower alone. Probability and statistics and pure random chance were all on my side, all suggesting that I would never hear my name called, that my life would continue on its expected trajectory toward a marriage to some local boy and children, and growing old in the same village where I had been born, dying in the same house where my grandmother had died, the cycle continuing unbroken as it had for generations. But fate, I would learn far too soon, has a cruel sense of humor and absolutely no respect whatsoever for probability or statistics or anything resembling fair play or logical distribution of fortune. Fate likes to pick the most unlikely outcomes and make them inevitable, likes to take the person who thinks they are safe and prove them catastrophically wrong, likes to demonstrate over and over again that the universe is not just indifferent to our plans, but actively amused by our attempts to predict and control our futures. The envoys departed as suddenly as they had arrived, their carriages vanishing back into that supernatural fog like they had never been there at all, like the whole thing had been a shared hallucination, brought on by bad wine or collective fever, or divine intervention. The square emptied slowly, reluctantly, people returning to their homes in small groups, their conversations hushed and worried and speculative. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other in years were suddenly huddled together in doorways, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to calculate how this would change everything, or whether it would change anything at all. My family walked back to our house in complete silence, each of us lost in our own spiraling thoughts about what this selection might mean, not just for whoever was unfortunate or fortunate enough to be chosen, but for all of us. For the delicate balance between humans and vampires that had held for the past 2 decades, since the last war ended with treaties written in blood and signed with bones. For the future that suddenly seemed much less certain than it had that morning when I had woken up worrying about nothing more significant than whether the bread would rise properly and whether I would have time to finish the carving I had been working on for my father's birthday. I did not sleep that night, despite my exhaustion, despite my mother's attempts to give me tea laced with herbs meant to calm the mind and ease the spirit into slumber. I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows cast by moonlight through my window creep across the plaster in slow, inexorable progressions that mark the passage of time with geological patience. I listened to the sounds of the village settling into uneasy rest around me, people behind their walls trying to pretend that nothing had changed, that tomorrow would be just like yesterday, that the selection was something that would happen to someone else, somewhere else, in some other version of reality that did not include them. Chapter 2. The morning after I tried to imagine what it would be like to be chosen, though my imagination failed me repeatedly, running into walls it could not scale. Tried to picture leaving everything I knew and loved behind to step into a world where I would be perpetually out of place, forever marked as the human girl who dared to reach above her station, the commoner who thought she could play princess in a castle full of actual royalty. Tried to imagine failing spectacularly, returning home humiliated and changed in ways I could not articulate, marked by that failure for the rest of my life like a brand burned into flesh that would never fully heal. Tried to imagine succeeding somehow, beating impossible odds to become something more than human, but less than vampire, caught forever in that liminal space between worlds where nothing and no one really belonged, where you existed as a cautionary tale rather than a person. Neither option seemed appealing. Neither option seemed real. And yet one of them, or something else I had not even considered, was rapidly approaching whether I was ready for it or not. Mostly, though, I tried not to think about it at all. Tried to convince myself that worrying was pointless when the chances of being selected were so vanishingly small as to be practically non-existent, when probability was firmly on my side. Tried to focus on my normal life, on the carpentry projects waiting for me in my father's workshop tomorrow, on the book I had been reading about ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen long before vampires revealed themselves to the world and changed everything, on anything except the growing certainty in my gut that something fundamental had just shifted in my world and would never, ever shift back to its original position. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly at once, the way significant days always do, time stretching and compressing in ways that made no logical sense. The envoys had said they would announce the chosen at sunrise the next morning, giving us exactly one night to marinate in our anxiety and fear and desperate hope. One night to imagine every possible outcome and prepare ourselves for none of them, because preparation was impossible for something like this. By the time pale light started creeping through my window, painting my room in shades of gray that would slowly warm to gold as the sun properly rose, I had given up on sleep entirely and was already dressed in my best clothes. Not because I thought I would be chosen, but because if by some cosmic mistake I wanted to at least look presentable when it happened. I sat on the edge of my bed trying to control the frantic beating of my heart, which seemed determined to hammer its way out of my chest and escape this entire situation on its own. The entire village gathered in the square again, and this time the atmosphere was completely different. Tenser, more afraid, more hopeful, more desperate. The possibilities had had all night to ferment in people's minds, growing more terrible and more wonderful in equal measure with each passing hour. Young girls stood with their families, some hoping desperately to be chosen despite the danger, seeing opportunity where others saw only a death sentence poorly disguised as honor, seeing a chance to escape lives they had not chosen and never wanted. Others prayed silently to whatever gods might still be listening, begging to be passed over, to remain safely invisible in their ordinary lives, to continue existing in comfortable obscurity rather than being thrust into extraordinary danger. Old women muttered about omens and portents and how none of this would end well because it never did when vampires got involved in human affairs. Young men looked angry and impotent, furious at being excluded from this process that would shape their futures just as much as it shaped the futures of whoever was chosen. The head envoy appeared exactly as the sun crested the mountains in the distance, her timing too perfect to be anything but calculated down to the second, choreographed for maximum dramatic effect, because vampires never did anything without considering the theater of it all. She held a scroll that seemed too long, too heavy, too important, inscribed with names in ink that shimmered like liquid silver in the morning light, like mercury caught in glass, like something that should not exist in our mundane world but did anyway, because vampires brought their own rules with them wherever they went. She began to read, her voice clear and emotionless and somehow more terrifying because of that lack of emotion. Each name landing like a hammer blow against an anvil, like a judge reading out sentences, like fate being carved into stone. 29 names, 29 girls whose lives were about to be irrevocably altered in ways they could not begin to imagine yet. Each announcement was followed by gasps or sobs, or in some cases, strange little sounds of triumph from families who saw this as their daughter's chance to rise above their station, to become something more than they had been born to be, to rewrite their destinies in ways that would have been impossible before this morning. I watched as girls I had known my entire life were called forward one by one, watched as their faces shifted through shock and fear and resignation, and occasionally something that might have been excitement if you looked at it from the right angle. Watched as they were handed formal letters sealed with the royal crest that looked uncomfortably like dried blood, dark red wax pressed with a symbol I had only ever seen in history books, never expected to encounter in real life. My name was called last, and in that moment before I heard it, I felt time slow down the way it does right before disaster strikes, the way it does in the instant before impact when you know something terrible is about to happen but you cannot do anything to stop it. I heard the envoy's mouth form the syllables of my name, watched her eyes scan the crowd until they found me standing there frozen with my mother beside me, saw the small, satisfied smile that played at the corners of her lips like she had been looking forward to this moment specifically. And I felt the world tilt sideways as every eye in the square turned toward me. Hundreds of gazes pressing against my skin like physical weight, like hands pushing me forward toward a future I had not chosen and did not want but would have to accept anyway, because refusing was not really an option, no matter what the envoy had said about choice. My mother made a sound like something had broken inside her chest, not quite a sob and not quite a scream, but something in between that held more pain than any simple sound should be able to carry. Her grip on my hand went from crushing to desperate, as if she could keep me there through sheer force of will, as if her love could somehow override whatever magic or fate or cruel coincidence had put my name on that list. Her eyes were already swimming with tears she refused to let fall, her jaw set in that stubborn way she got when she was determined not to break down in front of other people. Thomas, my little brother, looked up at me with eyes too wide and too knowing for someone his age, eyes that had already seen more of the world's cruelty than most children should have to witness. He asked me in a small, trembling voice if I would come back different, if I would have fangs when I returned and eyes like blood moons and skin cold as winter ice, if I would still remember him, or if the vampires would drink all my memories away along with my humanity, if I would still be his sister, or if I would become something else entirely, something that just looked like me but was really a monster wearing my face. I wanted to tell him that none of that would happen, that I would return exactly as I was, unchanged and unmolested by anything that happened in that distant palace. I wanted to promise him that no matter what, I would always be his sister, always love him, always come back to him. But the lie stuck in my throat because we both knew better, because we had both heard the stories about what happened to humans who spent too long in vampire company, and because I could not bring myself to make a promise I had no way of keeping. I walked forward on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone braver and more certain than I would ever be, someone who deserved to be chosen for something this important. The envoy handed me my letter with those too pale, too cold fingers that felt like touching marble that had been left outside on a winter night, and I felt magic tingle across my skin where we touched, felt something shift inside me like tumblers in a lock falling into place. The seal on the letter was warm, almost hot, and when I looked down at it, I could have sworn the wax moved, pulsing like a living heartbeat, like it was alive and waiting for something. The envoy told all 30 of us that we had 3 days to settle our affairs, say our goodbyes, prepare ourselves for departure and transformation. 3 days to transform from whoever we had been into whatever we needed to become. 3 days to accept that our lives as we knew them were over, finished, gone as completely as if we had died, and that what came next would be either glory or disaster with no comfortable middle ground available to cushion the fall. I spent those 3 days in a daze, moving through the motions of living while feeling like a ghost haunting my own life, like I was already gone and just waiting for my body to catch up to that reality. I helped my father in the workshop, running my hands over wood that I had carved just days before, but that now felt alien, like it belonged to a different world entirely, like I was already too changed to recognize the person who had made these simple objects with simple tools for simple purposes. I sat with my mother in the kitchen while she cooked my favorite meals with trembling hands, neither of us speaking because what was there to say that would not make this harder than it already was? What words could possibly contain or express or ease the grief of separation we were both already feeling? We sat in silence, and I watched her cry quietly into the soup she was stirring, watched her wipe her eyes with her apron when she thought I was not looking, watched her try to be strong for me when I knew she was breaking inside. I let Thomas follow me everywhere during those 3 days, his small hand always reaching for mine, as if he could memorize me through touch alone, as if constant contact would somehow prevent me from leaving or at least preserve some essential part of me that he could keep after I was gone. He barely spoke, just stayed close like a shadow, like he thought distance might make me disappear faster. On the last night, he crawled into my bed and curled against me the way he used to when he was much younger and had nightmares, and I held him while he cried and pretended to sleep, both of us maintaining the fiction that this was normal, that everything would be fine, that goodbye was not forever, even though we both suspected it was. On the last night, my mother finally spoke about what was happening. She told me that when she was young, before the wars that had shaped her generation and defined the relationship between our species for decades, she had seen vampires up close once. A whole court of them passing through our village on their way to somewhere more important. All impossible beauty and casual cruelty moving through our streets like we were invisible, like we did not matter enough to acknowledge beyond making sure we got out of their way quickly enough. She said she had never forgotten the way they moved, like they owned not just the earth they walked on, but the air itself, the space between moments, like reality bent around them, rather than them having to bend to accommodate reality. She said she had prayed her entire life that her children would never have to face them directly, never have to stand in their presence and feel that terrible weight of being in the presence of something so far beyond human that comparison became meaningless. Then she pulled me close and whispered something I would carry with me through everything that came next, something that would shape how I approached every challenge and every choice in the weeks and months ahead. She told me that monsters were just people who had forgotten what it meant to be afraid, who had lived so long with power that they no longer remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be mortal, to face real consequences for their actions. That vampires might be stronger, faster, more powerful in every measurable way, but they had one fundamental weakness they probably did not even recognize as a weakness anymore. They had forgotten what it was like to be mortal, to know that every moment could be your last, to understand the desperate precious value of a single heartbeat, a single breath, a single dawn you might not see repeated. She said if I could remember that, if I could hold on to my humanity and my fear and my mortality like weapons rather than weaknesses, I might survive this. I might even thrive. And if I was very lucky and very clever, I might teach them something they had forgotten in all their centuries of existence. I did not tell her that I was not sure I wanted to survive, if survival meant becoming something I did not recognize when I looked in a mirror. That some part of me, the part I was most ashamed of, was curious about what came next, in ways that felt like betrayal of everything I had ever known. That I had spent my entire life in this small village, following the same paths my parents had walked and their parents before them, and that the selection, terrifying as it was, represented something I had never dared hope for before. Change, possibility, a chance to become more than I had been born to be. A chance to matter in ways that went beyond being someone's daughter or sister or eventual wife, beyond the narrow roles available to girls like me in villages like this. I felt guilty for that curiosity, that interest, that tiny spark of excitement buried beneath all the legitimate fear and grief. Felt like I was betraying my family by wanting anything from this situation except to stay home and stay safe and stay exactly who I had always been. But I was starting to realize that who I had always been was not who I actually was, just who I had been allowed to be by circumstance and social position, and the accident of being born here rather than somewhere else. And maybe, just maybe, the selection would give me a chance to discover who I actually was beneath all those layers of expectation and limitation. The carriages came for us at dawn, and this time they were not the black nightmare vehicles that had brought the envoys, but silver ones that caught the morning light, and almost looked cheerful if you ignored the red-eyed horses and the drivers who moved with that telltale vampiric grace that marked them as other, as dangerous, as things that looked human, but very much were not. We were loaded in with our meager belongings, 6 girls to a carriage, strangers brought together by fate or magic or political necessity, to compete for a prize none of us were sure we actually wanted. As we pulled away from the village, I turned to look back one last time, pressing my face against the window so hard the glass felt like it might break. I saw my family standing there watching us leave, my mother weeping openly now that I could not see her directly, my father's face set in that careful blankness men adopt when they cannot afford to show emotion, when showing weakness feels like failing in some fundamental way. And Thomas, my beautiful brave little brother, waving goodbye like I was going on holiday instead of potentially to my death or transformation, or some fate worse than both. Something in my chest cracked then, not quite breaking, but fracturing in ways I knew would never fully heal no matter how long I lived or what I became. I raised my hand and waved back, and kept waving until distance and tears blurred them into indistinct shapes that could have been anyone, and then kept waving until the village itself disappeared behind hills and trees, swallowed by the landscape like it had never existed at all, like my entire life up to this moment had been a dream I was finally waking up from into a reality I was not prepared to face. That was when I understood, really understood with my whole being rather than just intellectually, that there was no going back from this point, that no matter what happened in the capital, whether I was chosen or eliminated, whether I lived or died, whether I remained human or became something else, I would never be the same person who had waved goodbye to her family in that small, forgotten village. The selection had already changed me just by beginning, and I had not even reached the palace yet. I had not even met the prince whose bride I might become. I had not even begun to understand what I had agreed to when that envoy read my name from her silver scroll. I turned away from the window finally, unable to watch the familiar landscape roll past any longer, unable to bear seeing everything I knew disappearing into distance. I looked at the other girls in the carriage with me instead. They all wore variations of the same expression, that peculiar mixture of fear and excitement and resignation that comes from knowing your life is about to change in ways you cannot control or predict. We were strangers bound together by circumstance, competitors for a prize we did not fully understand, allies in a situation where alliance might be the only thing keeping us alive. Chapter 3. The Journey. One of them, a weaver's daughter named Helena, with hair like spun gold, and eyes that had already seen too much for someone so young, caught me looking and smiled in a way that was sad and knowing and accepting all at once. She told me that her grandmother used to say that the best and worst moments of your life often felt identical when you were standing in the middle of them, that transformation and destruction looked remarkably similar until you had the perspective of time and distance to tell them apart. That you never really knew if you were beginning something wonderful or ending something precious until it was far too late to change course. I asked her which one she thought this was, and she laughed, a sound with absolutely no humor in it, a sound that was really just pain disguised as amusement. She said we would find out soon enough, that the truth had a way of revealing itself whether we were ready for it or not, and that was the last conversation we had for the rest of that long journey toward whatever waited for us in the capital. We sat in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts, our own fears, our own desperate prayers to gods who might or might not be listening to mortals anymore. The journey to the capital took 3 full days by carriage, 3 days that felt like 3 years and 3 hours at the same time stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. With each mile, the landscape changed around us in ways that felt symbolic, like we were leaving behind not just physical distance, but entire worlds of possibility. The rolling farmlands of my childhood, all gentle hills and cultivated fields and small villages that looked exactly like mine, gave way to darker forests where the trees grew so close together that sunlight could barely penetrate their canopy, where the air smelled of decay and old magic, and things that had died and then refused to stay dead. We passed through abandoned villages that had been thriving communities before the wars, remnants of the conflicts that had raged between our peoples decades ago when the peace was newer and more fragile, when both sides still thought they might win decisively rather than having to settle for uncomfortable coexistence. Burned-out shells of homes that had once sheltered families. Wells that had gone dry or been poisoned or simply been abandoned when everyone who knew how to use them had died or fled. Silence so heavy and oppressive it felt like something you could drown in, like the absence of life had become its own presence that pressed against your chest and made breathing difficult. The other girls in my carriage spoke in nervous whispers when they spoke at all, their conversations circling around the same topics, obsessively like moths around flame. One, a weaver's daughter named Helena with golden hair and eyes too old for her face, confessed she had dreamed of vampires every night since her name was called, dreams that felt more like memories than inventions of her sleeping mind. In her dreams, she said, the vampires wore crowns made of human bones and drank from chalices that never ran dry, no matter how much they consumed, chalices that seemed to fill themselves from some inexhaustible source of suffering. Another girl, Seraphina, a merchant's daughter with olive skin and black hair and a scar across her cheek from some childhood accident she refused to explain, claimed her grandmother had been taken by vampires during the last war and returned 3 months later, completely changed. No longer fully human, no longer fully vampire, but something caught between worlds, belonging nowhere. She said her grandmother had lived another 5 years before finally dying of something the doctors could not name, could not treat, could not even properly diagnose. She said that near the end, her grandmother had stopped eating human food and stopped being able to go out in direct sunlight, but had never grown fangs, and her heart had still beaten, slowly and irregularly, but still there, still functioning. She said her grandmother had warned them all before she died that vampires could never truly love mortals without eventually consuming them in one way or another, that the hunger was always there, always waiting, always looking for an opening, that even the kindest, most controlled vampire would eventually lose control or lose interest, and when that happened, the mortal who had trusted them would pay the price. She said that her grandmother's last words had been a warning to never, ever trust a vampire who claimed to love you, because vampires did not love the way humans did. They collected, they possessed, they consumed, but they did not love. I listened to all these stories but said nothing in response, keeping my own thoughts and fears carefully locked away where they could not be used against me. Fear was contagious in close quarters like this, spreading from person to person like disease, growing stronger each time it passed from one mind to another. I refused to let it sink its claws into me before I even reached the palace gates, refused to let other people's nightmares become my own. There would be time enough for fear once I saw what we were actually facing. No point in borrowing terror from uncertain futures when the present was frightening enough on its own merits. When we finally arrived at the capital 3 days later, night had fallen complete and absolute, as if the city itself was more comfortable in darkness than light, as if this was a place that only truly woke up once the sun went down, and the vampires came out to rule their domain. The palace rose before us like something conjured from nightmares and fairy tales in equal measure, too large and too ornate, and too impossible to be anything that humans could have built with mere mortal hands and mortal vision. Towers spiraled toward the sky like fingers reaching for stars they could never touch, their peaks vanishing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to cling to the structure like living things. Gargoyles perched on every ledge and cornice, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, their stone faces frozen in expressions of hunger and anguish and rage that made them look like they had been carved by someone who understood suffering intimately. The walls were black stone shot through with veins of silver that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, like the building had a heartbeat of its own, like it was alive in ways that had nothing to do with the people who occupied it. The gates opened for us without a sound, swinging inward on hinges that should have creaked and groaned but instead moved as silently as ghosts, and we were led inside by servants who moved like whispers given form and purpose. They guided us through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, endless hallways that twisted and turned in ways that made no architectural sense, that should not have fit inside any building no matter how large. The halls were lit by floating orbs of pale blue flame that cast no heat, magic made visible and practical, burning without fuel or oxygen or any of the normal requirements of fire. Mirrors lined the walls at irregular intervals, huge ornate things in frames that looked like they had been carved from bone rather than wood or metal, and our reflections in them looked wrong somehow, distorted. Like we were seeing ourselves through water or smoke or some medium that should not exist, like the mirrors were not reflecting what was but what might be, or what had been, or what we feared we might become. I tried not to look at them after the first few, tried to keep my eyes straight ahead and focus on following the servant, rather than examining what the mirrors wanted to show me. We were taken to a grand hall where the other girls who had been chosen from different districts had already gathered, all 30 of us assembled in one space for the first time. We stood beneath a vaulted ceiling that had been painted with scenes of ancient battles between humans and vampires, centuries of conflict rendered in painful detail across plaster and wood. Wars I had only heard about in history lessons, made real and immediate by the artistry that had captured every drop of blood, every expression of terror, every moment of triumph and defeat. I noticed something important as I studied those paintings while we waited. They showed both victories and defeats for both sides. Humans winning battles through cunning and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Vampires winning through superior strength and speed and magic that humans could not hope to counter. There was honesty in that artistic choice, a kind of brutal truth that felt rare in a place built on secrets and careful political maneuvering. Neither side was depicted as entirely noble or entirely monstrous. Both were shown as they were, capable of great courage and terrible cruelty. Heroes and villains depending on which side you were standing on when the battle ended. And then he entered, and everything else faded into irrelevance. Crown Prince Dorian. I had prepared myself for a monster. Honestly, I had. Something cold and inhuman, all sharp edges and predatory grace and eyes that looked at you like you were meat walking around pretending to be a person. I had steeled myself against beauty because I knew vampires were beautiful the way poisonous flowers are beautiful, the way a blade is beautiful right before it cuts you. What I was not prepared for, what I could never have anticipated no matter how many warnings people had given me, was the way he looked almost fragile standing there at the entrance to the hall. Tall, yes, with the impossible beauty that all vampires seem to possess, like a birthright handed down through generations of selective breeding or magic or whatever mechanism had made them what they were. Hair dark as midnight, black with hints of blue when the light hit it right. Eyes that shifted between gray and gold depending on the angle and the illumination, never quite settling on one color, always in flux. But there was something in his expression, a weariness that seemed to weigh on him like armor he had worn too long and could not figure out how to remove, that made him look younger and more vulnerable than any vampire should ever appear. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, and everything to do with carrying burdens too heavy for anyone to bear alone. He looked like he had not wanted this selection any more than we had, like it had been imposed on him by forces beyond his control, like he was as much a prisoner of circumstance as we were. And that recognition, that shared sense of being trapped in situations not of our own making, created a connection I had not expected and definitely had not wanted. He welcomed us with a voice that resonated through the chamber like distant thunder, like music, like something that should not come from any human throat. He told us that we had been chosen not by chance or random selection, but by magic that saw something in each of us, some quality or characteristic or potential that might allow us to bridge the gap between our worlds. He explained that the selection was not merely about finding him a bride or securing a political alliance, though those things mattered. It was about finding someone who could help him lead, who could help him navigate the impossible task of keeping two species that hated each other from sliding back into open warfare. Someone who understood both the mortal fears that kept humans awake at night and the vampire pride that prevented his kind from admitting weakness or seeking help from those they considered inferior. Someone strong enough to stand in the space between two worlds that wanted nothing more than to destroy each other, brave enough to insist there was another way forward, even when everyone else had given up hope. Someone who could survive not just physically but mentally, who would not be broken by the pressure or seduced by the power or destroyed by the attention. His gaze swept across all 30 of us assembled there, pausing briefly on each face as if he was trying to memorize us, trying to see past the fear and the careful masks we all wore to something more essential beneath. When his eyes met mine across the distance of that enormous hall, I felt something in my chest clench tight, something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but something in between. Not love at first sight, nothing that simple or stupid or fairy tale perfect. More like seeing a mirror held up that showed you not what you were, but what you might become if you were brave or foolish enough to reach for it. He held my gaze for perhaps 2 heartbeats, perhaps 3, time stretching out again in that way it does when something significant is happening, even if you do not understand its significance yet. In that moment, I felt seen in a way that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure, seen not as a peasant girl playing dress-up or a political pawn or a potential meal, but as a person, as someone who mattered, as someone who might actually be able to do what he needed done. Then the moment passed, and he continued speaking to all of us, explaining what would happen next. We would have lessons in etiquette and diplomacy, learning how to move in court circles without accidentally insulting anyone or revealing our ignorance. We would dine with the court, being tested and judged and evaluated constantly. We would be given challenges, both subtle and obvious, our responses analyzed for signs of intelligence, adaptability, strength under pressure, and at the end of each week, some of us would be sent home. Eliminated. Returned to our normal lives with nothing but stories and disappointment to show for our time here. I told myself I would be among the first to leave, that a prince would never choose someone like me, a girl from nowhere with nothing to recommend her except stubbornness and a refusal to pretend to be something she was not. A girl whose hands still bore calluses from real work, whose education had been spotty at best, whose understanding of politics extended only to the petty disputes of village life. He would see through me immediately, see that I had nothing to offer except honesty, and honesty was not enough to bridge centuries of hatred and mistrust. I was wrong about many things that night, standing in that hall beneath paintings of ancient wars, while a vampire prince explained what he needed from us. But I was most wrong about that, about whether I had anything to offer, about whether honesty might be exactly what was needed in a world built on careful lies and political necessities, about whether someone like me could possibly survive, let alone thrive, in a place like this. I was wrong about all of it, but I would not realize how wrong until it was far too late to save myself from the consequences of my own misconceptions. Chapter 4. The First Elimination. Our first week in the palace unfurled like a fever dream, each day blending into the next until I lost track of time entirely. The palace operated on vampire hours, which meant most of our activities took place after sunset when the court was most active. We slept during the day in rooms that had been sealed against sunlight, learning to reverse our natural rhythms, becoming creatures of darkness ourselves even though our hearts still beat and our blood still flowed warm in our veins. The lessons were exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical effort. We learned how to address vampire nobility, the intricate hierarchies of their court that made village social structures look simple as children's games in comparison. We learned that a vampire's age determined their status more than any accomplishment, that those who had survived longer were automatically granted more respect, regardless of whether they had earned it through deed or merely through stubbornness in refusing to die. We learned the history of treaties and betrayals that stretched back centuries, conflicts and alliances that had shaped both our species in ways that were still reverberating through the present. Our instructor was a vampire woman named Cassandra, ancient enough that her eyes held the weight of too many years, old enough that she remembered when humans had still been the dominant species, and vampires had hidden in shadows rather than ruling from thrones. She spoke with the kind of precision that suggested she had forgotten how to be anything but precise, every word chosen deliberately, every pause calculated for effect. She taught us that vampires valued honesty above all else, which struck me as profoundly ironic, given that their entire society seemed built on carefully maintained illusions and political necessities that required constant lying. But I kept that observation to myself. Survival, I was learning quickly, meant knowing when to speak your truth and when to swallow your words like bitter medicine and let them burn all the way down. It meant picking your battles carefully because you could not fight them all, not when you were outnumbered and outmatched in every measurable way. It meant being strategic rather than simply honest, even though strategy felt like lying by another name. The other girls began forming alliances almost immediately, the way people always do when thrown into competitive situations. Clusters of whispered conversations in corners, promises exchanged like currency, information traded for favor. Some tried to befriend me, but I held myself apart, not out of arrogance or superiority, but out of pure instinct, telling me that in a competition like this, today's friend could easily become tomorrow's enemy if the stakes got high enough. Trust was a luxury I could not afford, not when only one of us would be chosen and the rest would return home as failures. Prince Dorian observed us from a distance during those first days, and distance was the key word because he never approached directly, never engaged in actual conversation, just watched. He would appear in doorways during our lessons or walk through the gardens while we took our evening constitutionals. He never stayed long, never made his presence obvious, but I felt him there anyway. Felt his gaze like weight pressing against my consciousness, evaluating, judging, trying to determine which of us might possibly be what he needed. The first elimination came at the end of the first week, arriving like an executioner without warning or ceremony. 5 girls were sent home without explanation or justification, their names simply announced at breakfast by Cassandra as if she were reading a shopping list rather than destroying dreams. I watched them pack their meager belongings and board the carriages that would take them back to their ordinary lives, back to being nothing more than the girls who almost became a princess, forever marked by their inadequacy, forever defined by their failure to measure up to some standard they had never fully understood. Their faces showed mixtures of relief and disappointment in varying proportions. Some looked genuinely glad to be leaving this beautiful nightmare behind, to return to lives that made sense and followed rules they understood. Others looked devastated, as if being eliminated was confirmation of every insecurity they had ever harbored about themselves, proof that they truly were not good enough, not special enough, not worthy enough to stand in the same room as someone like Prince Dorian, let alone beside him. I waited for my own name to be called, half expecting it, half hoping for it if I am being completely honest. It would be easier to leave now, before I got too attached to this strange new life, before I started believing I might actually have a chance at something impossible. It would be simpler to return home and tell my family that I had tried and failed, that the prince had recognized immediately that I did not belong here, that everyone could stop worrying because the danger had passed, and I was still just me, unchanged and unharmed. But my name was not called. I remained, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a small traitorous voice whispered that perhaps I wanted to stay after all. Not for the crown or the prestige or any of the external trappings of success, but because something about this place, this impossible situation, this vampire prince who looked at me like I was a puzzle worth solving, had awakened a part of me I had not known existed. The part that craved challenge rather than comfort, that refused to be dismissed or underestimated, that wanted to prove, if only to myself, that I was more than the simple village girl everyone assumed I was. After the eliminated girls had departed and we remaining 25 stood watching their carriages disappear into morning mist, I felt the dynamics among us shift perceptibly. The competition was no longer abstract or distant. It was real and immediate and ruthless. We were not all going to survive this process intact. Most of us would leave eventually, sent back to our regular lives with nothing but memories of what might have been. Only one would stay. Only one would win whatever this was we were competing for. And looking around at the other girls, seeing the determination and fear and desperate hope in their eyes, I realized with absolute clarity that I wanted to be that one. I wanted it with an intensity that surprised me, wanted it for reasons I could not fully articulate even to myself. Not because I had fallen in love with the prince. I barely knew him beyond those few stolen glances and formal speeches. Not because I wanted to be a princess. Power for its own sake had never particularly interested me. I wanted it because for the first time in my entire unremarkable existence, I felt like I was being seen as something more than just another peasant girl destined for an ordinary life. I felt like there was possibility here, potential, a chance to become someone who mattered in ways that went beyond being a good daughter, or a loyal sister, or eventually a dutiful wife. A chance to prove that worth had nothing to do with bloodlines or social position, or any of the arbitrary markers people use to sort humans into hierarchies of value. I wanted to win because losing felt like admitting that everyone who had ever underestimated me had been right all along. Chapter 5. The Night Garden. He found me in the Night Garden 3 nights after the first elimination. I had gone there seeking solitude, needing desperately to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the palace, where every glance felt like judgment, every conversation like a test I might be failing without knowing it. The garden was supposedly off-limits to us candidates, but no one had explicitly forbidden entry, and I had always been better at asking forgiveness than permission. The Night Garden was exactly what its name suggested, a place where nothing bloomed except under moonlight, where conventional rules of botany seemed not to apply. Flowers opened their petals only in darkness, revealing bioluminescent interiors that glowed with soft blues and purples and greens, turning the whole space into something that belonged in dreams rather than waking reality. The paths wound through arrangements that seemed random, but probably followed some carefully designed plan I lacked the sophistication to recognize. Benches appeared at intervals, ornate things carved from wood that looked almost alive, as if the trees had shaped themselves into furniture rather than being carved by hands. I was so lost in thought, sitting on one of those benches trying to process everything that had happened in the past week, that I did not hear him approach until he spoke. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, making me jump and nearly drop the book I had been pretending to read, some dusty history of vampire-human relations that was supposed to help us understand the context we were stepping into. He apologized for startling me, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth that made him look younger somehow, more human, less like the distant, untouchable prince, and more like someone who might understand what it felt like to be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond your control. He asked me what I thought of his garden, and I answered honestly without stopping to calculate whether honesty was wise. I told him the garden was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, like looking at something that existed in a dream rather than reality, like walking through a painting that had somehow become three-dimensional and navigable. He nodded slowly, settling onto the bench across from me with that preternatural grace that made even simple movements look choreographed, and told me he had planted many of these flowers himself centuries ago, when he was younger and still believed beauty could exist without darkness, when he thought that things could be purely good without any shadow or complication. I asked him if he still believed that, and he paused, considering the question with an intensity that suggested no one had asked him anything genuine in a very long time, that his interactions were usually more performance than conversation. He told me that he had learned beauty and darkness were inseparable, that one gave the other meaning and context, that perhaps that was the lesson this garden had been trying to teach him all along through the very nature of its flowers that required darkness to bloom. We talked for hours that night, time passing without me noticing, minutes and hours blending together into a conversation that felt more real than anything else that had happened since I arrived at the palace. He asked me about my life before the selection, about my family and my childhood in a village he admitted he had never visited despite technically ruling over it and everyone in it. I told him about my father's carpentry shop, about the way wood smells when it is freshly cut and still holding on to moisture and life, about my brother who collected rocks and believed each one had a story to tell if you held it long enough and listened hard enough. He listened with an attention that felt almost painful in its intensity, as if every word I spoke was precious cargo he needed to store away carefully, as if my memories of an ordinary human life were somehow more valuable than all the centuries of his own experiences. When I asked him about himself, he grew quieter, more hesitant, but he did answer eventually. He told me that being a prince meant living inside a role rather than a life, that every word and gesture was calculated and measured against political necessity, every emotion carefully controlled and deployed strategically rather than expressed honestly. He said he envied humans their brief, bright existence precisely because it forced them to live authentically. When you only had 70 or 80 years if you were lucky, you could not afford to waste time pretending to be someone you were not. Vampires had so much time that truth became optional, something to be deployed strategically rather than lived constantly, a tool in the arsenal rather than the foundation of existence. I told him that sounded exhausting and lonely, 2 words I had not planned to use, but that came out anyway, honest assessment that I probably should have kept internal. He laughed, a sound like dark honey that made something warm and complicated bloom in my chest, something I did not want to examine too closely yet. He said, loneliness was the price of immortality, the tax levied on those who refused to die like they were supposed to, who cheated death and then spent eternity paying for that cheating in isolation. But then he looked at me with an expression I could not quite decipher, something between hope and desperation and curiosity, and said that perhaps loneliness was not inevitable after all. That maybe it was simply a symptom of never finding someone worth being honest with. Someone who would not use your truth against you or leverage your vulnerabilities into political advantage. Someone who saw you as a person rather than a prize or a political alliance or a meal barely pretending to be an equal. When I returned to my room that night, very late or very early depending on how you measured time, I could not stop thinking about the way his voice had sounded when he said those words, the way they felt like an offer or an invitation, or maybe just an observation he had not meant to share out loud. I could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at me like I was a puzzle he wanted to solve, not to master, but to understand, not to defeat, but to know. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was reading meaning into moments that held none, that this was dangerous territory to even consider entering. He was a vampire prince. I was a nobody from nowhere. Even if he chose me, and that was a very large if, it would be for political reasons. Strategic calculations about what message my selection would send to both populations, not because of anything I had said in a garden full of flowers that bloomed only in darkness. But my traitorous heart insisted otherwise, insisted that what I had felt in that garden was real and reciprocated, insisted that the connection between us was not just my imagination or wishful thinking, but something actual and tangible and terrifying in its implications. I did not sleep that night, just lay in bed watching moonlight move across my ceiling while my mind replayed every word of our conversation, analyzing it for hidden meanings and secret messages, like some kind of desperate code breaker trying to decipher enemy intelligence. By the time dawn came and sleeping hours officially began, I had convinced myself both that the whole thing had meant nothing, and that it had meant everything, that I was completely safe from emotional entanglement, and that I was already in far too deep to extract myself without damage. Both things were true somehow, paradoxically, impossibly. I was falling for someone I barely knew, someone who was not even the same species as me, someone who could kill me with a casual thought if he ever lost control or lost interest. And I could not seem to stop myself no matter how many logical arguments I constructed about why this was a terrible idea, why I should maintain emotional distance, why letting myself care about him was the fastest path to heartbreak or worse. The heart, I was learning, does not listen to logic or reason or well-reasoned arguments about self-preservation. The heart wants what it wants with the stubborn insistence of a child, and sometimes the only thing you can do is hold on and hope you survive the wanting.